Good evening. Welcome to tonight's webinar, Love is an Action Word, Reproductive Justice. This is the first of 4 monthly webinars on reproductive justice and faith in the wake of the Supreme Court's ruling last summer to overturn Roe versus Wade and the constitutional protection of access to abortion care. This series is co-sponsored by the Office of the General Minister and President, the National Benevolent Association, and Disciples Women's Ministries. I am Rick Lowery, retired professor of Hebrew Bible and former president of the Disciples of Christ Historical Society. I am honored to serve as moderator for tonight's discussion with 3 outstanding disciple scholars who have particularly strong academic backgrounds for tonight's conversation. The Reverend Dr. Lisa Davidson, the Reverend Dr. Stephanie Buchanan Crowder, and the Reverend Dr. Brandy Daniels will help us explore biblical and theological resources for the church's reflection and action in this changed legal and pastoral landscape. I'll say more about each of our panelists after I give a bit of history and a brief overview of our session tonight. The idea for the 4 webinars emerged from discussions last summer within the Office of the General Minister and President and with Disciples Women's Ministries, and a bit later in conversation with the General Cabinet of the Church. I had not yet retired from the Historical Society and therefore was part of the initial conversation in the General Cabinet. That's why I'm here tonight. From those discussions, a planning committee was convened, and we decided on a series of church-wide webinars to discuss the theological, pastoral, and practical implications of the Supreme Court decision for individuals, congregations, and the various ministries of the church. The goal of these webinars is to promote informed theological reflection and respectful conversation, to provide information, and to share and discuss ideas about how we as individuals and as the whole church can and should respond. What are we doing already? What can we do better? What new things can we try? And how do the resources of our faith guide us? These webinars are designed to be educational, to promote mutual learning, to provide practical information about what our various ministries are doing already to respond to this changed legal landscape, and to share ideas and solicit feedback as we come to terms with it. True to our church's history and theological legacy, we begin the series by turning to biblical and theological resources as the starting point for our reflections. In tonight's webinar, we'll invite our 3 outstanding biblical and theological scholars to share their particular expertise and perspectives. Each of them will come on screen individually for a brief reflection on the topic. Then we'll all come together on the screen together and respond to questions that may come in from you and that we may have among ourselves. We have about a half hour set aside for that portion. After that, each of our 3 panelists will have a couple of minutes for any final remarks and suggested resources for further reflection and dialogue. I'd like to begin the introductions by saying a little bit about myself, so I don't have to follow the list of accomplishments of this astonishing panel of scholars who will share their wisdom with us tonight. By far, most importantly, I have for 42 years next week been married to the Reverend Dr. Sharon Watkins, who served the church as congregational pastor, educational administrator, and for 12 years as general minister and president. So I've had a parsonage eye view of the church for most of my life. Sharon and I met at Yale Divinity School in 1980 and married the following August. After earning my MDiv, I continued at Yale and earned a PhD in Hebrew Bible. I taught most of my career at Phillips Theological Seminary in Oklahoma and served as interim dean and academic vice president at Lexington Theological Seminary in Kentucky. I've taught classes in all of our disciple seminaries and have preached and taught throughout the U.S. and Canada and beyond. I have written and edited a number of books and articles, and am currently writing and working on a book, Genesis, Human Rights, and Climate Change. Sharon and I retired last fall and moved back to Indianapolis to hang out with our family. I'd like to now invite the Reverend Dr. Lisa Davidson, and then I'll say a little bit about her, invite her into the space. Hey, Lisa. Dr. Lisa Davidson is Johnny Ergel Cadjo, Professor of Hebrew Bible and Interim Vice President of Academic Affairs and Dean at Phillips Theological Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where I used to teach. A native of Radford, Virginia, Dr. Davidson has a BA in Religion and Spanish from Lynchburg College, an MDiv from Bright Divinity School, and an MA and PhD in Hebrew Bible from Vanderbilt University. She's ordained in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ and has served congregations in Texas and Kentucky. Davidson's first book, Preaching the Women of the Bible, was published in 2006. Her other publications include the commentary on the book of Job for the New Interpreter's Study Bible, essays on the major prophets for the College Study Bible, an essay in Table Talk, entries for the Encyclopedia of the Stone Campbell Movement, a sermon in Those Preaching Women, a multicultural collection, commentaries for the New Proclamation series, Year C, and essays on Ruth and Naomi and Bathsheba for Just Women Bible Study. One of her sermons was selected for inclusion in the Living Pulpit, sermons that illustrate preaching in the Stone Campbell Movement. She also wrote 6 essays for the Preacher's Bible Handbook, and her latest book, More Than a Womb, Child-Free Women as Agents of the Holy, is currently on sale from Chalice Press, I think. Prior to joining, she'll correct me if I got it wrong. Prior to joining the faculty of Phillips Theological Seminary, Lisa was professor of First Testament at Lexington Theological Seminary and professor of religious studies at Lynchburg College. Dr. Davidson is a member of the Society of Biblical Literature, who's often invited to speak to local congregations and retreats on various topics in the Hebrew Bible, women in the Bible, sexuality in the Bible, and the Christian use and misuse of the Hebrew Bible. So I want to welcome you, Dr. Davidson, and invite you to share your wisdom with us.
Thanks, Rick. Actually, my last book was published by Cascade Books, not Chalice. So just want to clarify that. I am really honored to be a part of this panel and to speak about a topic that I have great passion for. A couple of things about me. Why does this matter to me? Well, my simple answer is because I'm a woman, and anytime women's rights are being taken away, I tend to want to be a part of how to fight that attempt to make women less free in our country. I'm also an aunt, and growing up with Roe v. Wade having been decided, I never dreamed that my nieces, great nieces, would live in a country where they had fewer rights than I had. And for me, that's the problem. Women's freedoms are being slowly eroded and quickly eroded, depending on where you live. And this reproductive justice is a big part of what we're seeing in this country. I have several areas of expertise that help me in addressing this topic. First, as Rick mentioned, I am a professor of Hebrew Bible. Most of my research in Hebrew Bible has been around women in the Bible, as well as contemporary issues in the Bible, including questions about abortion, stem cell research, etc. I have done a good bit of research around women in the ancient Near East and trying to help us as biblical readers to see these women as more than just baby producers, as more than their fertility potential. And that's what my last book was trying to do, is to suggest that not only are there women in the Hebrew Bible who were mothers and very valued for that, but there are also women in the Hebrew Bible whose stories are about something other than their ability or inability to procreate. I mentioned doing some work with stem cell research. That is not the same as abortion. They often overlap, particularly in the areas of when life begins and the status of an embryo. And so that has informed my ideas about abortion as well. And probably the most unique perspective that I bring is that I am a child free woman. I am, as you can tell, an Anglo woman. I'm a cisgendered heterosexual woman who has been married for 33 plus years without any children, and that was by choice. And I can tell you that as a child free woman, there is a lot of discomfort and even judgment about women who don't produce children. And probably the worst place for that is in the church, as folks don't quite know what to do with women who are defying their expectations. In my research around my book on child free women in the Hebrew Bible, I also encountered some ideas about natalism or pronatalism, which is the states in, forcing, or some might say encouraging, women to reproduce in order to keep the nation strong, to build up your army, if you will. While we might think of that as something from the ancient world, it is still very present in this world. When I address the issue of women's reproductive justice, I often want to do away with some of the terms like pro choice and pro life. But on the other hand, I like to embrace them both. I truly believe I am pro choice, and that's because I am pro life. And I guess you could say I'm pro woman. I think that one of the aspects of individuality is the ability to decide what you will do with your life, and in this instance, how your body will be lived out in this world without the government or anyone else trying to tell you what you have to do, or the church, I guess I might say as well. I certainly have information that we can talk about later about what the Bible says about abortion, though I will just give you a quick little summary. At least as far as the Hebrew Bible is concerned, it says absolutely nothing about abortion. And I think sometimes when we look to the Bible to answer questions like that, we're asking too much of the text, and we're not wanting to take into account the socio-historical context in which these texts developed, as well as the ideological perspectives of those who composed, collected, and put into the canon as we know it today. So I hope that in our conversation with one another later, the issue of what biblical texts can do as helpful information for this conversation on reproductive justice will be a topic for us to discuss. I think that's all I've got for now. As you all know, professor, preacher, I could talk forever, but I want to give time now to hear from my co-panelists.
Thank you very much. Oh, Thank you very much, Lisa. Dr. Dr. Davidson. Sorry, Lisa and I have known each other for many, many years. It's kind of hard for me
That's all
to
right.
get used to saying proper titles. um, Thank you very much, and we'll come back to you in just a little bit. Our next panelist is Dr. Stephanie Buchanan Crowder, who is Vice President and Academic Dean and Professor of New Testament at Chicago Theological Seminary. She has a particular interest in bringing the worlds of theology, sports, and pop culture into conversation with one another. My wife, Sharon Watkins, told me when we started thinking about this whole conference. She said, "Well, you know, Stephanie, Stephanie is my go-to biblical theologian." So I'm really thrilled that Stephanie is able and willing to be with us tonight. Uh, she was the first woman and the first African American to hold the position of Vice President of Academic Affairs and Academic Dean at Chicago Theological Seminary, and the first African American woman promoted to full professor at CTS. She's a native of Memphis, Tennessee. She attended Howard University, where she earned a Bachelor of Science degree and graduated summa cum laude in speech pathology and audiology. She has served on the boards of various civic organizations and has served the General Church on the boards of National Convocation and the Division of Overseas Ministries. She earned her MDiv in 1994 from United Theological Seminary in Dayton, Ohio, where she also, along the way, earned the Anderson Theology Award for scholarly writing and was recognized for her honors work in preaching and Greek. She was licensed by Metropolitan Baptist Church in Washington, D.C., and ordained by her home church, Friendship Baptist in Memphis. She served on the staff of Mississippi Boulevard Christian Church in Memphis as Assistant Minister of Christian Education. She served as Associate Regional Minister for Women's Ministries for the Christian Church in Tennessee, and was Associate Pastor of New Covenant Christian Church in Nashville for 15 years. She and her husband co-founded the Empowerment Church. As project director of MICTAN, she provided HIV/AIDS training to congregations throughout the U.S. Dr. Crowder earned her PhD in New Testament from Vanderbilt University in May of 2000. She was the 1999-2000 Fund for Theological Education Dissertation Fellow, which is a great honor, as well as a fellow for the Wabash Center for Teaching and Religion. She has published just a number of books and articles and has been active online. She's written a faith-based curriculum for addressing substance abuse for the Congress of National Black Churches. She's authored numerous resources related to faith and health. So she's had a lot of particular interest in issues of health and medical services. She's had a number of sermons appear in my hometown newspaper when I was growing up, the Nashville Tennessean, and she blogs. She provided scholarly commentary for a television series. She ponders social media and theology, and has served as the editorial on the editorial board of a number of online and other publications. Stephanie writes on the spiritual benefits of yoga in Disciples Women magazines. She has written her second book was When Mama Speaks: The Bible and Motherhood from a Womanist Perspective, where she brings together Black mothers, pop culture, and biblical stories. Let's see, her latest project is Are You for Real? Imposter Syndrome Theology and Society from Cascade Books. She's taught at Fisk University, American Baptist College, Belmont University, Shaw University Divinity School, Mid-America Center for Ministry, and McCormick Theological Seminary. And she was a 2017 inductee into the Morehouse College Martin Luther King Jr. Collegium of Scholars. In 2017, she was a keynote lecturer for the 103rd Hampton University Ministers Conference. Most recently, she was selected as member of the 2022 HBCU Executive Leadership Institute community of fellows. She is a much sought after preacher, lecturer, author, workshop leader, and facilitator. She is married and a hashtag womanist mama of 2 sons. So I am very thrilled to welcome my friend Stephanie Crowder to the conversation to share her wisdom with us. Stephanie.
Well, thank you, Dr. Rick Lowery. I'm afraid the introduction may be longer than the presentation. So I was like, wow, you make people begin to age themselves. Like, have we done all of that in all of these years? So thank you for that very extensive, but definitely not necessary introduction. What an honor it is to be here. And thank all of you, Reverend Terisna, and for the invitation, and to my co-panelists. Thank all of you for the opportunity to be in this rich dialogue during this much needed time. Let me begin here. Beyonce says, I think the most stressful thing for me, it's balancing work and life. This she told for an article in Elle Magazine. She stated in an article for Elle Magazine in 2019. But TIAA-CREF CEO Amanda Duckett says there's no such thing as work-life balancing. Here's what Tupac in his song Dear Mama says: all I could see you coming home after work late. You're in the kitchen trying to fix us a hot plate. You're just working with the scraps you were given, and Mama made miracles every Thanksgiving. Toni Morrison says the idea of love for her grandmother was that they had a place to stay. Her mom's idea of love was that they had a roof and clothes and food. Morrison said her idea of love was that her children had choices and freedom. My grandmother, her idea of love was that bees are not acceptable. My mom would always say to her friends, her idea of love was complimenting her children. And she would always tell her friends, isn't my daughter beautiful? So when I come to this dialogue, to this conversation, I'm coming to this as a Black woman in the United States, from the South, grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, educated, living in the Midwest. I come to this through a womanist perspective, womanism as an entry point, and it's not my exclusive interpretive framework, if you will. And by womanist, I begin looking at this idea of Black women, this idea of what are the ways in which Black women engage race, class, and gender. What are the ways in which Black women are seen through this kind of tripod or this tripartite approach of race, class, and gender? But as Dr. Lowery noted, I've added this idea of womanist maternal thought, meaning what are the nuances that are specific to Black women as mothers? And how do we navigate race, class, and gender through the framework of motherhood? And so, yes, in my book, When Mama Speaks, the Bible and Motherhood from a Womanist Perspective, I put into conversation biblical mothers with mothers in pop culture. So I'll easily have a conversation about Rispa and the sacrifice that she makes. And I'll put Rispa in conversations with the mothers of the movement. When you think about Sabrina Fulton, Lucia Macbeth, when you think about these are the mothers of Trayvon Martin, the mother of Michael Brown. So, how do these mothers of the movement, who in many ways have had to mourn publicly, how do they talk to Rispa, if you will? So, in my book, I talk about these ways in which we put the current and the historical into conversation. I also began to talk about Morrison and Beyonce and matriarchs, as Tupac talks about his own mother, who become the framing, if you will, for this embodiment and how I began to think about Black mothers. I also began to think about what Tenerife Dew calls the angel sisters, these matriarchs of justice, these sheroes, these warrior women, such as Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and Fannie Lou Hamer. And I particularly lift Fannie Lou Hamer because when she was 44 years old, Fannie Lou Hamer had what they called a Mississippi appendectomy, meaning she went to the hospital because she was having some reproductive challenges. She was having some women's issues, as she says. But when she left that hospital, Fannie Lou Hamer had been sterilized without her consent. So I think as we're having this conversation around Roe v. Wade and Dobbs, that we also have to think about current day sterilization practices. What's going on for our sisters, our siblings who are incarcerated? Erica Cohn's Belly of the Beast exposes these state sanctioned sterilizations in California prisons. I think we have to expand this conversation to not only talk about sterilizations, but also talk about to access to health care for Latino, Black, Native American, and Indigenous women as well. There's a race issue. There are also socioeconomic factors when there's not money, when there's not resources. But we even have to think about, well, what are the times when race trumps, if you will, or race supersedes economic status? I'm thinking about Serena Williams talking about her experience and what she had to go through in delivering her first child. So there are political factors, there are physical factors, there are medical factors. What do we do about here in the United States that we have unpaid maternity leave? There is now a omnibus bill that's trying to make its way, it's been slowly trying to make its way. And this bill trying to adjust the very high maternal mortality rate here in the United States. It's a bill that's trying to address childcare costs. So I think in talking about all of this, we need to broaden the metes and bounds of of this conversation. That we need a comprehensive conversation. That what we're dealing with requires in-depth, detailed, multidisciplinary dialogues. That we have to broach this from wide-ranging social, economic, political, geographical, cultural, theological, spiritual, hermeneutical, existential, axiological, moral approaches. We can't simply talk about just black or white or that, but there's much color, if you will. There are many shades in between. We have to really talk about this whole language that's involved in this. What are the ways in which we, yes, protest with our prayers and, yes, pray with our feet? I'm particularly interested as someone who's in higher education. I just completed 5 years as an academic dean at Chicago Theological Seminary and looking forward to dwelling into being full professor. But I'm curious as to, we had two Supreme Court rulings back to back, one related to affirmative action, the other one related to student loans. And so I think there's some connections here because we have to think for so many aspiring first generation college graduates, what does this lack of funding mean to them? For so many students who want to go to college, what does affirmative action, this kind of lack of access? What happens when students get to college and they're needing reproductive care then what does Dobbs do as it relates to that? I'm a New Testament scholar, so I'm supposed to give you at least one biblical verse, and that's the one from Jude. I'll start there. Jude says that above all else, I wish that you would prosper and be in good health, even as your soul prosper. And so I think we have to think, what does it mean for everybody to have access to health? So that healthcare is not just, some kind of privilege, but healthcare is indeed a right. I look forward to additional conversation.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was really rich. And we will come back to you for further conversation after we hear from um, our next panelist. So thank you, Stephanie. Um, our next panelist, I'd like to invite Dr. Brandy Daniels to come into the room. Hi, how are you, Brandy?
Howdy, howdy.
It is great to see you. We don't have as long of a history with one another, but we have come to really appreciate, or I've come to appreciate you in the conversations that we've had over the last few months. Dr. Daniels is assistant professor of theology at the University of Portland in Oregon. Prior to coming to the University of Portland in 2020, Dr. Daniels was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Virginia. Her research and teaching explore the intersections between constructive and political theologies, social ethics, and feminist and queer theories, particularly around questions of identity, community, and difference. Um, Dr. Daniels has published on topics ranging from Bonhoeffer and Foucault on racial identity to post-structuralism and liberation theology to Eastern Orthodox theology and psychoanalytic theory. It's just amazing the breadth of her scholarly interest and expertise. Her current book project, How (parentheses not question mark) to be Christian, identity, formation, and difference, engages these themes with particular reference to contemporary feminist theologies. Brandy serves as co-chair for the Queer Studies and Religion Unit of the American Academy of Religion, as the co-chair for both the LGBTQ and Queer Studies Interest Group and the Women's Caucus of the Society of Christian Ethics, and she's on the executive committee of the Political Theology Network. She is an ordained Disciples of Christ minister. She has a PhD in religion, in theological studies with a certificate in women's and gender studies, and a minor in ethics from Vanderbilt University, where she also earned an MA in religion. She earned a Master of Divinity from Duke Divinity School with a certificate in gender theology and ministry in 2010, and a master's degree with a certificate in African and African American studies from Duke University in 2011. She graduated from Azusa Pacific University in 2006 with a BA in Biblical Studies and Youth Ministry and a BA in psychology. She's the author of just an astonishing number of articles in peer-reviewed scholarly journals, chapters in edited books, and articles in online scholarly publications, as well as she's published a number of critical book reviews. She's received numerous academic grants and fellowship. Fellowship. She is an avid slow runner and Jeopardy fan, and the proud parent of an adorable tiny pup, which the theologians among us will love. A pup named Carly Barks. Ah,
There she
that's
is.
great.
She's actually named after Karl Marx, not Karl Barth. So
Yeah.
should I take it
welcome,
over from
welcome,
here?
Brandy.
Yeah. I had to, show off the dog. I'm delighted to be with you all. I will, this is one of the occasions where it is last and definitely least. And I am honored just to be here amongst everyone else. And, also I think putting theology last as opposed to esteemed biblical studies, here for it. And I'll also echo Dr. Buchanan Crowder in that I think that introduction is longer than I'll speak for, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. Yeah, I'm ordained in the Disciples tradition. I teach theology and gender and women's sexuality studies, co-chair of that department, and teach in my primary departments in theology. And I'm one thing that I want to name because it's shaped my continuing kind of interest in this topic. Unlike my esteemed colleagues here with me, reproductive justice is not kind of my primary field of scholarship. I mostly do work in queer studies. Obviously, there's great deals of overlap and intersectionality there, but my queer feminist studies background has gone in kind of different directions. But I teach in a gender, women, and sexuality studies, right? So it comes, it's in the air. But I think why it has come up more for me lately is I'm teaching in a Catholic university, right? So I'm not tenured yet. So hopefully, and academic freedom and all that, right? But I have to be like, it comes up differently there, but it comes up in ways that I think are really, really important in ways taking seriously and has made me look into this issue more, right? Yeah, again, my primary field of studies is queer studies, and I've kind of come to queer studies earlier on. When I first got into, I went the apologetics route early on of like, what does the Bible really say? What do I really think about this? And now I'm quite clear about where I stand. And moved beyond what Lynn Tonsett calls moving beyond apologetics, right? And if anything, I've come to the question of reproductive justice in the same way, right? Of like, ooh, I don't know what I think, but I still love the people, right? And ooh, yeah, no, I know what I think, but like I understand how people come from all the sides. To, oh, this is a deeply important theological issue that shapes people's lives, and how we think about these things does matter. And obviously, again, all of these things are complicated, right? But my trajectory, my interest in reproductive justice kind of follows that same trajectory that got me into queer studies and queer theology. And thinking about what that means for thinking about reproductive justice, being particularly at a school that is rooted in a tradition that has some pretty strong things to say about that. And what does it mean to take tradition seriously? What does it mean to look at tradition? And as a theologian, that's kind of my shtick, right? Scripture, tradition, reason, and experience. I'm more Reformed than Wesleyan, but those are my sources. Again, I'm more interested in the conversation, but I think in most of my work, I crib from others because this isn't my primary area of scholarship. I'll name from the get-go kind of two of the thinkers I think the most with. Three of the thinkers I think the most with would be Toddy Peters, Rebecca Todd Peters. Much of what I'm going to say right now is cribbing from her. Maggie Komitsika, Margaret Komitsika being another one, and then Jeremy Posadas being the third. Responsible women don't have unplanned or unwanted pregnancies. Women who get pregnant have to live with the consequences of their behavior. If you don't want to have a baby, you shouldn't have sex, right? These are some of the things I heard, even from when I moved to a more moderate thing, but like, ooh, like how do we think about these things? And Toddy Peters talks about how these are rooted in what she calls the justification paradigm, right? That the debate around reproductive justice, the debate around abortion, right, seeks to either justify women's right to it, the pro-life side seeking, the anti-choice side seeking to limit and even eliminate acceptable justifications, right? And another way of my into this conversation is as someone who does work in and ethics, particularly how we think about how do we do community that takes difference seriously? How do we think our different identities in relation to each other, right? How do we think about how we know and how we approach things? And the question, I think the question I want to raise, right, is pregnancy always a moral good? And I'm not saying that in those are the three kind of theological sources I'm drawing on. But the other kind of key source I draw on, which each of those three theological sources I'm drawing on is reproductive justice, right? Is as Stephanie, as Dr. Buchanan Crowder kind of pointed out and spoke at much more beautifully than I will about of Black women's, in particular, Black women's work in this arena, speaking of the ways in which the kind of key principles of reproductive justice, the right to not have children, the right to have children, and the right to parent in a healthy and safe environment, right? Stemming, going all the way back to 1994, the Women of African Descent for Reproductive Freedom Coalition, right? Tony Bond Leonard, Reverend Alma Crawford, Loretta Ross, right, drawing on their work in that history of saying, how do we think about these things differently? And what does it mean theologically? What might it mean to have a theology of reproductive justice? And I think at the heart of that for me is like moving beyond the justification paradigm, which I would argue is the wrong one, but is the wildly predominant one, right? Of pro-choice, again, this question of is pregnancy always a moral good? Again, not from a like the right to be pregnant and to have children if you want them, and the right to not if you don't want them. And again, that big question being who determines that, right? And Toddy's Peters' argument is that women should, right? What does it mean to trust women? And that it is only through the experience of birth that Peters draws on this language of the prenate, right? How we think about the prenate as a way to rethink that paradigm. Only through the experience of birth does a prenate cross the boundary into the land of the elder, the human. And the status of the prenate is absolutely one that's important, but it isn't the same as the child, right? And so how do we reimagine how we think about abortion outside of a logic of justification, and with thinking again theologically outside of a justification or a logic of individualism, right? A logic that is bound up within a kind of both sides of this argument. And how do we think about how prenatal interdependence is important, and how we think about the relation to the prenate and the mother, the person carrying, right? Whomever that might be. But one of the things, again, thinking about epistemology, how do we know, and how do we view, how do we know? This is, handing it back over to biblical scholars, right? Hermeneutics, right? Who gets left out? Whose stories aren't seen and whose stories aren't heard? Right. I'm thinking particularly here about kind of those iconic images that anti-abortion activists, right, of the baby inside the womb, not the like horrifying ones, but the like, oh, look at the baby developing, right? And those go back to like Leonard Nielsen and the life images from 1965, right? But all those images of seeing, right? What's missing in those images? What's missing is the woman carrying the child, right? The human carrying the child. So what does it mean to take seriously how we might trust women? um, um, again, coming from a Catholic tradition, the magisterium argues that the church has a consistent ethic on this, but it's actually, right, Maggie Komitzka in her work kind of points out some of the ways in which this is pretty complicated. And how do we take bodily autonomy seriously? And when does the prenate become a child, right? Peter's argument is that it becomes a child upon birth. But Komitzka kind of argues, and some other thinkers argue, that there's a moment of the quickening, right? Who decides who knows when the prenate has become a child? The mom, right? And we have a history of tradition telling us that. So again, thinking about these things theologically, what does it mean to think about choice versus rights versus justice? What does it mean to think about intersectionality? What does it mean to think about this systemically? And again, my esteemed colleagues have already talked about this. And what does it mean to think of embodiment and experience as a lens as we approach these questions theologically? As we, if the task of theology is to speak of God and to speak of God's vision of flourishing for us, what does it mean to, again, building on reproductive justice, think about combating reproductive repression, right? And the ways that plays out within white supremacy, the ways that plays out with neoliberalism, the ways that plays out with patriarchy and misogyny, and the ways that plays out within Christian tradition and history. Those are my intro. And I guess my final thing I'll say is my intro is like, how do we think about law as not a proxy for morality, right? The ways in which law might hurt people. And that might be the wrong tool to use. And I think there's resources within the disciple tradition, as a free church tradition, the Stone Campbell movement. How do we think about moral formation from our own tradition, from our own perspective, not as an abstract issue, but from a consistent ethic from our own context? Simple.
Thank you very much. Boy, a lot of food for thought there. Thank you. We will now enter a period of conversation that I'd like to start bringing the other panelists onto the screen together. Oh, there we all are. And I'd like for all of us to be unmuted so we can have some conversation among ourselves. Boy, what a rich set of presentations. I'd like to follow up on some of the things and explore in a little greater depth. First, I wonder, Lisa, you said that you feel somewhat uncomfortable with the pro-life, pro-choice dichotomy, and I gather it's not so much the pro part of it as the implied anti part of it. If you're on this side, anti. But I would like to explore with you a little further and then ask the other folks to throw in their 2 cents worth on it. What is it that do you want to say more about that?
Yes, it is the implied anti, but it's also, I think, a problem I see by many who claim to be pro-life, and they're really pro-fetus. When the child is in utero, yes, we're all for the child, but the moment it's born, they're not going to provide good health care to that child. They're not worried about whether they grow up in safe neighborhoods. They are not worried about the quality of their education. And so that's what pro-life really, why I struggle with that. If you are pro-life, you need to be pro-life for the whole human being and their whole life, not just while they're in utero. And pro-choice is also kind of limiting, in the sense that I guess I shouldn't have to be pro-choice. I'm a strong believer in freedom, free will that we were given by our Creator, and so to have to say I'm pro-choice is almost like redundant, because we all are given choices. We all have to make choices for ourselves. Some of those are very limited by systemic issues, but like I said, I would like to have this conversation around the broader picture of human. I think Brandy used the flourishing of a human being. What is it in my mind that the divine desires for human beings to know this wholeness, and that means all of life, not just one segment of that life. So that would be one way I would answer that question.
Boy, it seems to me that both Stephanie and Brandy spoke pretty eloquently about precisely the issues that you're raising. Stephanie, do you want to say anything about that? Elaborate any further on what you've already said?
No, Lisa, I think Dr. Davidson talked about. I didn't use language of. I use language of how do we broaden the conversations, because I think if we get caught around the terms of pro-choice, pro-life, we will eliminate a lot of other factors. We will eliminate a lot of other services. We will ignore systemic roadblocks that are put in place to prevent women from accessing health and health care. So, if we pitch our tents on abortion and when the soul comes into the fetus and all of that, well, then we'll miss some of the key steps and some of the key structures that preclude women from having access, to birth control, if you will. So let's start there, or just even having conversations around body, right, and parts of the body, being able to name the parts of the body, as they are. I think we all perhaps saw the recent Time article on a seventh grader in Mississippi who just had a baby, right? So, we want to talk about, this is what, Dobbs does now. But are you kidding me, right? Here's a seventh grader, 13-year-old, who she was raped living in Mississippi, had to carry a child full term. And I can't imagine, being 13, I'm a baby, and having to, no, unfortunately, look at the baby and it's from a rape. And so, again, how do we talk about race? How do we talk about economics? How do we talk about political factors that go into all of this? There is a wonderful article from Sojourners. It's just phenomenal, and it says it's a brief history of religious support for abortion and reproductive rights. And I think, to what Dr. Davidson was saying, that we have to realize the conversation has shifted. I always say that context frames content, but if we sort of look back, centuries, that it was always religious institutions who were advocating for women's rights over their bodies. And so, if you think about these kinds of ways in which there's been this kind of history, if you will, of the clergy consultation on abortion, and what in the 1960s, even the National Council of Churches came out, UCC folk supporting and, women's rights to choose. But it all changed, decades later. So, in biblical scholarship, we say, we think about ways in which the content has been shaped by the context. And I think this conversation epitomizes that.
Hmm. Brandy, did you have more that you wanted to
I
add?
mostly just ditto, right? I think the only thing I would add is, right, if one of the kind of arguments or logic is, right, well, someone, that someone harm being done to someone doesn't mean harm should be done to someone else, right? The prenate, right? Of, oh, okay, just give it up to adoption. I don't think we can think about that. One, again, as again my esteemed colleagues have pointed out, right, like the broader contexts, right? Like, how do we think about how medicine is practiced? How do we think about how um, uh, when a woman's life is at risk, that abortion, which again is actually a medical term, right? A miscarriage is called a spontaneous abortion, right? It isn't considered as an option, right? How is that a consistent ethic of life, right? And if we, then, but one of the kind of main arguments is, well, like adoption, right? I think we have to think seriously and complexly about the legacies of adoption, right? And the legacies of colonialism, and the legacies, how we think about the foster care system, right? There's a lot of research out there in terms of, again, thinking about intersectionality, thinking about racial justice, right? Like, we can't just be like, just put it up for, like, there's a certain logic undergirding that too, that we have to take seriously in terms of how do we, who are we setting up to, again, the first key principle, the key principles of reproductive justice, right? The right to have children, but the right to have children, right? And the right to parent in a safe and healthy environment, right? If we don't give people the resources to parent in a safe and healthy environment, we say, just give your kids up to someone who can afford it. What does that mean? What does that do, right? Like, is that a consistent ethic of life and a consistent ethic of flourishing? Yeah, mostly, again, ditto.
And I might just chime in. Stephanie, you mentioned the church has always been working on this issue. I think it was like mid 1970s that the disciples passed a resolution supporting a woman's right to choose. And I had someone ask at this past assembly, like post Dobbs, why didn't we have another resolution? And the respondent said, well, did you write one? But we have, as disciples, this long history of trusting women and being concerned with
Mhm.
the whole life. So just throw that
Mhm.
into.
Yeah. Yeah, and I will say that our general minister and president has spoken on this issue, I think, very eloquently. We have at least a couple of General Assembly resolutions through the years that have passed on this issue. Of course, General Assembly resolutions are not binding on
Yeah.
every member of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, but our church as a whole has spoken very clearly on this issue in the past and continues to. Um, I wonder if uh, y'all might offer some commentary, some comment, some opinion on a question that has come in, which is phrased this way: for the pastors watching, how do we preach a sermon that
Mm.
reflect the points that have been stated here tonight? And then I have a couple of other questions I want to
Mm.
be sure that we cover, I'll just throw that out for you to see if any of you have some suggestions about how pastors might actually preach about this stuff.
Mm.
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the approaches I have taken, as I said, is to kind of uh, lift up biblical stories about women who are valued for who they are beyond their reproductive choices or reproductive abilities. I think even in our 21st century world, there are still many who think women have to have a child to be a whole woman,
Mm.
to be a full person. I mean, I read it's in my book, Irma Bombeck or someone said, you really don't know love until you've had a child.
Mhm.
And so perhaps lifting up stories about women who are empowered and called to do something major, like Miriam or Deborah or Huldah. None of these women are ever described as mothers or barren, but their stories are key moments in the history of the people of Israel. So that's one way I think we can lift up just valuing women and who they are as made in the image of the divine.
Mm. I think, you know, I go the route of I lift up mothers, but I also think about, lifting up. Of course, there's always the kind of Mary Elizabeth thing. There's that, but I'm always curious about Paul's maternal language. So whether you like Paul or not, there's some maternal language that Paul uses, in Romans 8, which is very curious language for me. But I'm also curious about, and I think, yeah, to Lisa's point, women who are not identified as mothers. But I think Jesus reframes what should be a private moment. It becomes a public mess, if you will. But I think Jesus takes a public mess and reframes it as, here's this woman's right to this private moment. And so I live, for example, the whole John 8, which is questionable, right? It's in brackets. So it's like, well, did John actually write that or not? But this whole, this questionable woman that's caught in adultery, right? And so, she's brought, and there's, well, where's the man? But what are the ways, I think, in my own kind of hermeneutical divine eye or sanctified imagination, how I imagine Jesus sort of taking what people have made as this kind of public spectacle and saying, well, this really isn't any of your business. And so, what are the ways in which, we can say perhaps some things are just not public business? And so this woman's story in John 8, the woman's story in Luke 7, the quote unquote sinner woman, right? In 736, who, profusely crying and wiping Jesus's feet. What are the ways in which Jesus takes these public moments that are really nobody's business, but uses them as a way to say, to restore, and I don't even say if the women need to be redeemed, but I think to say, this is not your business, this is her business. And so I think there are ways in which there's some boundaries between public and private, that can be placed. And I think it's a way to preach that some things are just not for the public square.
I'm not the biblical scholar, and I haven't. I that's so that yeah again, but as a professor, right? Also, but as only that, um, coming at it from not preaching but also teaching, right? Like, and I think the examples you all gave is like, how do we think about this creatively and differently, and what are the undergirding lessons, right? Like, one of the things I do in my classroom, right, we do a simulation, when I finally got bold enough to teach about this stuff at Catholic school. How do we think about these things through these different paradigms, right? And I do a simulation with my students of like this unknown disease that I get from Jeremy Posadas, an ethics scholar, who kind of crafted this. And there's a bunch of literature out there I'm happy to share. But like, how do we, there's an unknown disease that hits men of childbearing age, right? Like, here's the requirements, what do you do about it? And we do like this whole Senate thing, and people have to vote, right? And like like, how do we get people thinking about like, what are the issues at stake, right? About privacy, about autonomy, about full flourishing in the broadest senses, right? And I'm happy to say more about that, but my point is like, sorry, the dog. I'm gonna mute. But how do we think about it creatively, right? How do we draw upon our resources in teaching and preaching to think about how this is a political issue, right? But how to move beyond a certain paradigm of the politics that we're operating with, to say, how do we think about this more robustly in terms of flourishing, in terms of a theology of reproductive justice, in terms of an ethic of not just life but flourishing.
This is wonderful conversation. There is an issue that I would like for us to devote a little bit of time to, because we're kind of running out of time at this point. But there are people for whom this really is a matter of human life, and when does human life begin, and when does it end? And I wonder how you three, what wisdom you might be able to share with us about any of that. And I can just let you decide, or I'll start going with Lisa and move around the move around the circle here.
I feel like you just threw me a big lob, but
I did.
yeah. As I said before, when people ask me like, how does the Bible answer these questions? On the one hand, I can say it says nothing about abortion, reminding them of the context, particularly in the Hebrew Bible, where reproduction was necessary in order for the population to stay up, with all the environmental and other factors that happened. So when you go looking for it in the biblical text of the Hebrew Bible, like the closest thing anyone has ever found really is a text about what happens when two men are fighting. This is in Exodus 21, I think. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it says that, if the men fight and there's a pregnant woman next to them, and they harm her so that she loses the baby, they pay a fine. Mm-hmm. But if they harm her and she loses her life, then it's considered murder. So that's a pretty interesting text. But I think with the issue of life and when does life begin, obviously back then they have ultrasounds or those other technological pieces that we have, which really has been the defining factor, as even how the Catholic Church defined when life began. As technology develops, you can know more about what's happening inside. But I always go to, and I know Rick's here as well, the text of the second Genesis creation story that starts in Genesis 2:4b and goes till the end of the chapter, where this is the one where the very human-like deity is going to create the first human being and uses the ground, the Adamah, to make Adam, which is not a proper name. It's actually kind of a pun. And this clay figurine the divine has shaped is just that, um, until the divine blows breath or the breath of life into its nostrils. And then it becomes a living being, which in the Hebrew, the word is nephesh, which is that life force that makes you who you are. Either you have a nephesh and you're alive, or you don't have a nephesh and you're not alive.
Right.
And so that kind of first taking your breath, first being a separated individual, if you will, really is formative for me and how I think about life and how life functions as when it begins and ends. But it also has factored into many Jewish conversations. Obviously, you can't say anything for all Jewish people,
Right.
but in some of the traditions, particularly Reformed, I can speak more authoritatively on. They do not consider the fetus a person until it takes its first breath outside the body. And so, for many within that context of Judaism, all efforts are focused on the life of the mother, the quality of her life, her health, whether it's physical, mental, spiritual. That is what is the first factor in how they discuss issues of reproductive choice. And her life takes precedent over the fetus that is still. I was going to say the word parasite, and that's really terrible. But this being doesn't have a life without this body that it's feeding off of. So when I talk about when life begins in any sense, I would say it's when we're breathing and we're conscious. And at the end of life, when those things stop, for me, that's when life, well, as in Ecclesiastes, that which is of the earth returns to the earth, and that which is of the divine, that breath, returns to the divine. So that's my quick little brief summary. I could certainly say more, but for me, that's very formative.
Thank you for that. I'll ask the other two, and that will have to be our last question. But Stephanie, do you have
Yeah, I
anything to
think
add?
we'd have to look at sort of extra canonical sources, sort of like the Didache, that which actually means teachings, and so you do have sort of explicit examples there about that women should not, abort, kill a fetus, but you don't find that language in our canonical text, right? In New Testament texts at all. I mean, yes, you have this sort of wonderful kind of plaything that's happening with Jesus and John the Baptist in utero, and so all of that. But I just think we just have to be very careful. I go to a couple of texts for me and say Matthew 25. When was I hungry? When was I naked? When was I thirsty? When was I in prison? How do we call to question the systems? What are the ways in which we see Jesus taking care of the widows, the orphan, and those who were poor, those who were disinterested, those who were marginalized? How do we look at maternal language? That's in the text. How do we look at language around women, and women being empowered? Jesus brings women to the center, if you will, in the biblical text. And I think 1 Corinthians 13, the greatest of these is love. And it is not not just our love that's so human and that's so frail, but it's that divine love, if you will. So it is a love that questions systems. It is a love that says that everybody is entitled to and has a right for care and for life, and to survive and to thrive and to flourish.
Yeah, my final note, I have to sneak out. And I know we're done here, but again, just to echo what everyone else said, and just to say, um, yeah, again, how do we think life more broadly? Some of the legislation, some of the rules are actually inhibiting life, right? Of ectopic pregnancies when there's no viability, but saying, nope, you have to carry it to term, even if the woman's going to bleed out, right? Is that an ethic of life, right? So how do we think about these things more broadly? Who gets to determine where that, like doctors, finishing their residencies are not able to so, are not, or choosing not to do so in states where there's these laws, right? Like that's not contributing to an ethic of life, to an ethic, right? Like the maternal mortality rates, right? How do we think about the ways in which who's, one of my favorite gender theorists, Judith Butler, right? Whose lives matter and whose deaths are grievable, right? And how do we take seriously that lives matter, that Black lives matter, that women's lives matter, right? And think of those things on a non-abstract level. Yeah. So I'm going to sneak out on that note and let you guys give the closing
Well,
pieces.
Brandy, thank you. Thank you. I know you have to slip out. There is one more question that I want to ask. You can go on, but there's one more question that has come in that I'd like for the two of our biblical scholars to take a stab at, and that is that the relationship between politics and theology. There are a lot of church members who feel like this is a political issue, um, and I remember my teacher at Yale, Letty Russell, who used to say there are no non-theological issues. Um, uh, but I'd like for you to respond to those who feel like, well, this is just politics, and this is not something that should be addressed in the church.
My first comment is yes, it is political because it involves human beings and the police, the city, and you can't get around that. I think what people really mean is they don't want you to be partisan,
Yeah.
and they confuse those two terms a great deal. And certainly, from the Hebrew Bible perspective, everything is logical. There is no separation of the
Right.
sacred and the secular.
Right.
And certainly, the prophets had no trouble talking about political problems, pointing out the political injustices, the way that they were failing to take care of the least of these, and did that boldly. For me, as a Hebrew Bible scholar, I tell my students, yeah, you're going to have to talk about political issues. The thing is, don't be partisan, but these are part of our life. And if faith is not factoring into that within the congregation, then we certainly shouldn't expect faith to factor into it in the public square. And that's where I think sometimes some Christians get so riled up about what the Bible says or doesn't say, and they don't even think that the other people in the public square may not put any authority in the text that they're quoting or citing. So, yeah, that's my kind of take. You have to talk about the political. It's what we've been talking about with what happens in taking care of human community. So,
Stephanie?
Yeah, I mean, you can't talk about New Testament without talking about Roman imperialism and domination and supposedly
Right.
Pax Romana. I mean, seriously, I mean, Jesus, is crucified. I mean, how political do you get? We as disciples, what do we do every time we gather? This is the body and this is the cup, if you will. That's that. We yes, it's theological, but it's also it's a political remembrance. In many ways, context again drives content. So I think in having these conversations, we dare not divorce the political from the theological. I think it is a matter of that, you know, I don't think people want to know which side we're on, So as long as we can, hey, gather at the table, perhaps without necessarily knowing who's on what side, I think that may be where some of the rub comes. I think once we begin to see that perhaps some folk close to us may see things a little differently, may read the Bible, perhaps a little differently than we do, then we have those challenges. And I think it goes back to what Madam GMP said, during, the General Assembly, stay at the table, that regardless, still stay at the table. And so I think, my son just came down. I'm at a friend's house. And my friend is a reporter for the Washington Post, and he's working on an article where here it is that a woman who wants to have an abortion has to go through a window in order to avoid anti-abortion protesters, right? So this is the political world that we're living in, that a woman has to climb through a window in order to exercise, a right over her body. And so then where are we, as a church saying, well, wait a minute, how is that safe? How is that unneighborly? What can we do to sort of stand in the gap, if you will, be repairers of the breach for not just this woman, but any other woman, so that people don't have to climb through windows, right? To so that they in many ways can have care, for their bodies.
Thank you so much. This has been such a rich conversation. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Stephanie. And thanks to Brandy, who had to
Mhm.
leave a little bit a few minutes ago. I would like to just conclude this by offering up a prayer. Oh God, thank you for this evening of conversation and reflection. We pray that you continue to empower us to have honest and respectful conversation and to take action on behalf of all human beings. And we ask these things and pray for your empowerment and your courage and your boldness as we move forward from this session. We ask these things in the name of Jesus. Amen. And we would like to invite everyone to attend the second in this series of webinars, which will be on September 21st at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And we look forward to seeing you there.